Nick Reinberger with you here on The Morning Show. Nice to have you with us. Some recent cases that have come to light have indicated the need for more speech pathologists within our justice system. There are certain kinds of conditions and, of course, certain kinds of backgrounds, which means that people may not understand exactly what is being said to them and may not be able to communicate to the judge their particular circumstances. Mary Woodward is a Speech Pathology Australia's Senior Advisor in Justice and joins us now here at ABC Alora. G'day, Mary. How are you going?
Good day. Nice to meet you.
Mary, what do speech pathologists actually do?
That's a very good question, a very broad question. So speech pathologists work with people across all ages, anything to do with communication and swallowing. So communication being a real broad umbrella heading for speaking, listening, understanding, being able to put your thoughts into words, being able to communicate socially, for example. And speech pathologists will assess people's strengths and challenges when it comes to communication and will then intervene, either doing one-to-one therapy or giving advice or other strategies to help people overcome those difficulties.
The swallowing's interesting, I have to say,
Sure,
Mary.
sure.
So that's not necessarily anything to do with speech, but is that within, say, aged care where you have to give people very particular kinds of foods to make sure that they don't choke?
Yes, that's right. So all sorts of different conditions can lead to mealtime difficulties or swallowing difficulties, and swallowing difficulties can make it really hard for people to eat or drink safely and can potentially lead to choking, which in some cases can be life-threatening. So speech pathologists will, again, assess and then advise on how best to facilitate someone's eating and drinking to make sure that they are as safe as possible.
Well, we wanted to talk a little bit about speech pathology within the justice system.
Yes.
If someone has what's called a developmental language disorder, how does that affect them when it comes to interacting with the law? So
developmental language disorder is a condition that's not very well recognised, even though it's estimated as affecting approximately 1 in 14 children, so that's about 2 in every classroom. But in young people who are in custody in Australia, the figures are approximately 1 in 2. So half of young people who are in custody in Australia have language disorder, and even greater figures than that, 80 to 90% have language skills that are below the average range that would be expected for their age. Developmental language disorder can affect all aspects of talking, understanding, processing language. It can increase the risk of social, emotional, or behavioural concerns, including increasing the risk of engaging in offending behaviour. And there can be really, really serious consequences, both legally as well as socially and emotionally, if someone is unable to participate effectively in a police investigation or a court hearing. So, for example, if they don't understand what the lawyers are asking them, or if what the judge is saying to them, or they're unable to put their thoughts into words to explain their perspective in the way that they would want to. And similarly, once in detention, if that is the route that the young person has to go down, if someone has some form of disability, if they're detained without necessary therapeutic support, that can have really significant impact on their future, as well as the sort of shorter term mental health and well-being. And speech pathologists have a really key role to play in both scenarios, so both in police investigations or in courts, and that would be acting as what's called an intermediary, or as a therapist working in a youth justice centre or in a community youth justice setting, or in adult correctional facilities as well.
And how would a speech pathologist actually work with someone in that case? Do you almost act like you're an interpreter in the same way that someone that doesn't have any English might get an interpreter?
Yeah, similar but different. Intermediaries, which is the role that the speech pathologist would be playing if they were in a courtroom, for example, are professionals with expertise in communication, and they're recruited and specially trained to assess an individual's communication and then support that communication with the police or courts. They don't have to just be speech pathologists. They can come from a range of professional backgrounds, but the majority are speech pathologists. And they're, just as an interpreter would be, they're impartial officers of the court. But their job, I suppose, is to advise the police or the courts about how best someone's communication might be supported, whether that's through modifying how questions are asked or modifying how they might be able to give their answers so that they can participate as effectively as possible. I think it's important to note that not all Australian states and territories have introduced intermediaries yet. So one of the recent cases that you alluded to at the beginning has been in WA, and WA doesn't yet have an intermediary program. And of those that have, so New South Wales does have an intermediary program, but the focus is on alleged victims in child sexual assault matters. And while, of course, they're very vulnerable witnesses who deserve to have consideration of how their needs may be best met, given the high prevalence of communication needs amongst young people and adults who do engage in offending behaviour, and as we've mentioned, the risks associated with not being able to participate effectively, we strongly believe that intermediaries should be available to anybody with communication needs, including defendants. I think it's a human right to be able to access the justice system fairly.
Where would you come into the system, Mary? Is that something that the lawyers should be advocating for? Like legal aid and that kind of thing. At what point should a speech pathologist hypothetically come in?
So in an ideal world, a referral for an intermediary who, as I say, maybe is likely to be a speech pathologist, but not necessarily a speech pathologist, would be sought right at that individual's first contact with the police. And the intermediary would make assessment of that individual's communication strengths and needs as they relate to how, the expectations that are going to be on them in an investigative process. And then they would advise the police about how the interview might be conducted. Obviously, it is still the police's responsibility, but the intermediary will provide advice around the communication in that. And the intermediary might also actually be present in the interview and intervene and actually say if they think there's a communication breakdown or if they think that something else could, if there's a different strategy that could help the individual communicate and give their best evidence. And then that intermediary ideally would follow through to if there was a trial, and they would meet with the lawyers and the judge beforehand and again discuss what modifications to the trial process, in particular to the questioning, might be advantageous so that that individual is able to give their best evidence, so that there can be quality evidence. And I say it's important that anybody who is expected to give evidence is able to give their best evidence, whether that's the complainant or the alleged victim or the accused. Everybody needs to be able to understand what's being asked of them or give their answers in the best way that they can.
Fair enough. Well, it's been great to meet you, Mary. Thanks for coming on the program today.
No worries. Thanks for having me.